You've probably been told that avoiding social life is a red flag, that preferring solitude makes you antisocial, weird, or even broken. But what if the opposite is true? What if isolation isn't a flaw but a sign of genius? Schopenhauer believed that intelligent people avoid social life not because they can't connect, but because they see too much. And once you start noticing what most people ignore, fake smiles and small talk stop making sense. In a world obsessed with being seen, the smartest minds often choose to disappear, not out of fear, but out of clarity. They're not running from people. They're running from noise, from masks, from mediocrity dressed as friendship. And here's the twist: that loneliness you've been shamed for might be your greatest advantage. But there's a hidden cost, a price most don't see coming. Stay with me until the end, because once you understand what Schopenhauer uncovered, you'll never look at social life the same way again. In fact, you might stop chasing it altogether. There's something oddly familiar about the silence that surrounds certain minds. When you think about people like Schopenhauer, Tesla, Emily Dickinson, or Newton, you don't picture them at a party, making small talk. You see them alone, thinking, creating, lost in thought. That's not by accident. The absence of social life wasn't a flaw, it was a pattern, a rhythm that great minds seem to share. Many of them weren't antisocial, they were anti-superficial. And in a world that glorifies constant connection, those who choose solitude are often misunderstood. But behind their strategic distancing, there was a deeper need to protect their inner world from the noise of the outer one. It wasn't loneliness for them, it was design, a conscious choice to focus inward rather than be consumed by shallow distractions. Let's be honest, if you've ever felt out of place in a crowd, or like small talk was draining your soul, maybe you're not broken, maybe you're just wired for depth. And when you're wired for depth, surface-level conversations feel like static. It's not easy to explain that to people, but some of the brightest minds in history didn't explain, they withdrew. Which brings us to a more uncomfortable truth about the society they were withdrawing from. Schopenhauer didn't just critique society, he dissected it con precisione chirurgica. To him, most social interactions were like theater, flashy on the outside, hollow on the inside. He believed that much of what people call social life was just a desperate attempt to escape their own emptiness. And when you're deeply thoughtful, that kind of noise is not just annoying, it's exhausting. Think about the last time you went to a gathering. How much of the conversation was truly meaningful? Chances are, it was dominated by gossip, empty laughs, and discussions about the weather. That's not connection, that's distraction. And for someone craving depth, that environment feels like quicksand. Every minute in that room pulls you further away from your true self. Now, imagine you're a genius, like the ones we mentioned earlier. Your thoughts are galaxies ahead, yet the room is buzzing about the latest celebrity breakup. Frustration of genius isn't just poetic, it's painfully real. Social life becomes a minefield of boredom, where the price of isolation feels more like a privilege than a punishment. He stops showing up, not out of arrogance, but out of sheer preservation. But what if the superficiality of society isn't the problem, but rather a reflection, a mirror showing us how most people fear silence, fear thinking, fear feeling deeply? And those who embrace that silence, who walk away from the stage of appearances, they start noticing something others miss completely. That's when the intellectual distance becomes not only obvious, but liberating. As intelligence grows, so does the silence around it. Schopenhauer believed that the smarter you are, the harder it becomes to find someone who truly understands you. It's not about ego, it's about reality. The deeper your thoughts, the fewer people there are who can swim in them. And suddenly, social life feels like explaining quantum physics to someone reading a fortune cookie. This is where strategic distancing comes in, not as a wall, but as a filter. It's the conscious decision to preserve your energy, your ideas, your peace. People who think deeply often carry mental worlds within them, and not everyone deserves access to that inner landscape. Solitude becomes a sanctuary, not because you hate people, but because your mind thrives better without their noise. It's the same reason some geniuses kept journals instead of joining clubs. Emily Dickinson didn't travel the world, she explored the universe inside her room. Newton didn't network, he worked alone until the laws of motion emerged. This loneliness wasn't always sweet, but it was productive. The price of isolation paid off in the currency of breakthroughs. But this gap, this intellectual canyon, doesn't just isolate, it elevates. It turns loneliness into a kind of freedom, freedom to think, to create, to feel without interruption. And once you taste that kind of liberty, going back to superficial interaction feels like suffocation. Still, that freedom isn't free, and that brings us to something most people fear to admit. Solitude can be a sanctuary, but it can also be a storm. While many geniuses embraced the silence for clarity, they also wrestled with the emotional weight that came with it. When you're constantly misunderstood, when your ideas echo unanswered, that silence can turn into something heavier. The price of isolation isn't just peace, it's the cost of feeling alien. And sometimes, that cost shows up as anxiety, melancholy, or even despair. Let's not sugarcoat it. Being ahead of your time can feel like a curse. You see the world more clearly, but that clarity can be overwhelming. Nikola Tesla, for instance, died alone in a hotel room, not because he lacked brilliance, but because society couldn't keep up with his vision. That's the frustration of genius in full display. Isolation, in his case, wasn't just chosen, it was imposed by a world that didn't understand him. And yet, for many people who think deeply, there's this tension. They crave connection, but dread the emptiness that often comes with it. You go to a dinner party and leave feeling lonelier than before. Why? Because being around people who don't see you can hurt more than being alone. It's like standing in a crowd, screaming with your soul, and no one hears. That's the subtle grief behind social life when your mind operates on another level. But here's the twist. That grief doesn't have to consume you. It can become fuel. Fuel for art, for writing, for invention, for insight. Isolation isn't just a void, it's a forge. And the ones who endure its heat often come out transformed. Yet, in that same forge, they also begin to see something odd about the world they left behind. Schopenhauer didn't just critique society, he called it out. For him, social life resembled a stage where everyone wore masks, playing roles they didn't even believe in. The smiles were rehearsed, the compliments calculated, and the conversations mostly hollow. It wasn't malice, it was habit. People learned to perform instead of connect, and that's where the disconnect begins for those who crave truth. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to be polite for hours, even when your soul is begging for something real? That's the trap of the social stage. You're expected to nod, smile, agree, even if you're mentally miles away. For someone driven by authenticity, that kind of acting feels like betrayal, not to others but to yourself. That's why strategic distancing becomes survival, not arrogance. In Schopenhauer's eyes, true connection was rare precisely because so few people dared to remove their masks. And he wasn't wrong. Much of social life revolves around reputation, not revelation. You don't talk about your fears or dreams, you talk about sports, sales, and traffic. It's not conversation, it's camouflage. And for minds wired for depth, that camouflage suffocates. This explains why so many deep thinkers eventually choose solitude over company, not because they hate people, but because they can no longer tolerate the artificial. They start to see every handshake, every compliment, every laugh with new eyes, and often, those eyes don't like what they see. But beyond this curtain of performances lies something even more troubling. Schopenhauer observed something brutal but true. Most people are looking for applause, not on purpose. They live for show, not for understanding. If the clothes are fashionable, if the feed looks nice, if the opinion pleases, great. But asking why am I here, that's scary. Geniuses, on the other hand, don't want applause. They want answers. They're not chasing approval. They're chasing the meaning of life. And when you're on that path, priorities change. Gossip becomes noise. Appearance becomes distraction. While many struggle to fit in, those who think outside the box prefer to stay out. Not because they think they're better, but because they can't pretend that it all matters. Their search is inward, not outward. That's why traditional social life begins to seem empty. Let's face it, those who are looking for meaning often scare those who are only looking for validation. It's like turning on a flashlight in a room full of sleeping people. Nobody thanks you, they complain about the light. And then isolation sets in, sometimes voluntary, sometimes imposed. The truth is that many brilliant minds have not been rejected for being bad, but for thinking too much, feeling too much, seeing too much. This causes the so-called frustration of genius, that silent feeling of always being out of place. No matter how hard you try, conversations seem too short, ideas too big, silences too long, solitude ceases to be an option and becomes a kind of armor. You protect yourself not because you want to, but because this causes the so-called frustration of genius, that silent feeling of always being out of place. No matter how hard you try, conversations seem too short, ideas too big, silences too long, solitude ceases to be an option and becomes a kind of armor. You protect yourself not because you want to, but because you have to. And along the way, something begins to change in the way you see the world. Validation loses its luster. The noise of the crowd no longer mesmerizes you. You begin to realize that what seemed normal was just a repetitive cycle of approval and appearance. And when that realization hits, the next step is inevitable. One of the cruelest ironies is when a brilliant mind tries to share a deep thought and the room goes silent, uninterested. That moment when someone pours out an insight and the response is a shrug or a subject change, that's not just rejection, that's a slow erosion of the soul. The frustration of genius isn't just about being unheard, it's about realizing that most people aren't even listening. You see this pattern again and again in history. Philosophers mocked, inventors dismissed, writers ignored while alive. Van Gogh sold one painting in his lifetime. Kafka begged for his work to be burned. It's not that society doesn't need genius, it just doesn't know what to do with it. And so, the genius retreats. Social life becomes too painful, too noisy, too empty. At some point, the isolation becomes more than a choice, it becomes a shield. It's not that the genius hates people, it's that the repeated indifference teaches them to protect what they create. Strategic distancing becomes not a luxury, but a necessity. They learn to speak to journals, to paint for walls, to compose for silence, because silence, at least, doesn't interrupt. But that frustration never fully disappears. Even the most reclusive thinkers long for a real conversation, one where ideas are welcomed, not dismissed. It's a craving that runs deep, not for praise, but for resonance, to feel, just once, that someone else truly understands. And in the absence of that, solitude begins to feel safer than hope. Still, there's a flip side to this forced detachment, a hidden benefit few recognize. Because once the genius stops chasing understanding from others, something unexpected starts to grow within. Schopenhauer flipped the narrative. What if loneliness isn't a curse, but a gift? In a world obsessed with noise and approval, solitude becomes sacred ground. It's where thinkers breathe freely, unburdened by the expectations of others. The absence of distraction creates space, not just mental, but spiritual. And in that space, ideas blossom in ways crowds never allow. Many of the greatest breakthroughs in history weren't made in boardrooms or dinner parties. They were born in silence. Newton watching an apple fall, Dickinson scribbling poetry in her quiet room. Solitude gave them something society couldn't: uninterrupted clarity. That's why some people begin to crave loneliness not out of pain, but out of creative necessity. Think about your own life. When was the last time you had a quiet hour without alerts, calls, or someone needing something? It's rare, right? But in that rarity lies the secret. Strategic distancing isn't about ego, it's about self-preservation. The price of isolation may be high, but the return on investment, immeasurable depth and vision. Of course, not everyone sees it that way. To outsiders, the loner looks odd, even tragic. But internally, that person might be living their most vibrant reality. Free from the masks, the scripts, the endless validation loops. They're no longer auditioning, they're finally writing their own script. And that kind of freedom doesn't come from applause, it comes from within. Still, even the most self-sufficient minds sometimes pause and feel the pull of something deeper. A tug, not toward crowds, but toward something harder to define. A whisper of connection that even silence can't replace. Solitude may be a sanctuary, but it isn't always serene. Even the most brilliant minds who embrace strategic distancing aren't immune to the ache of human connection. After all, we're wired for belonging. You can crave silence and still miss laughter. You can protect your peace and still long for a shared glance that says, "I get you." This is the dilemma of isolation. On one side there's freedom, mental, emotional, even creative. But on the other, there's melancholy, a quiet, persistent feeling that something's missing. It's not about needing attention. It's about needing resonance. A simple conversation where you don't have to shrink your thoughts or censor your soul. Even Schopenhauer, for all his love of solitude, understood this tension. He knew that the human heart, no matter how evolved, still beats with a desire to be seen. It's not weakness, it's humanity. And when that need goes unmet, loneliness begins to echo louder than any applause ever could. That's why solitude must be balanced, not with noise, but with truth. Some turn to nature, others to books, a few to rare friendships that don't require performance. These become the antidotes, small but powerful ways to soften the edges of isolation without losing the freedom it provides. Reading Marcus Aurelius, journaling under moonlight, walking without a destination. These aren't distractions, they're lifelines. But the most powerful solution Schopenhauer offered wasn't external at all. It was a mindset, a kind of philosophical detachment that reframes loneliness into liberation. And that's where his final insight comes in. According to Schopenhauer, the true secret to happiness isn't found in applause or company. It's found in emotional detachment, not coldness, but clarity. Strategic distancing means engaging with the world without being consumed by it. It's choosing your presence with intention, not obligation. You're not isolating to escape, you're withdrawing to preserve what matters. This mindset flips everything. Suddenly, you don't need constant validation. You don't fear missing out. You don't chase attention, you choose meaning. You become the curator of your own experience, and with that comes power. The power to say no, the power to walk away, the power to think for yourself, even if it means walking alone. Strategic distancing doesn't mean hating people. It means being selective with your energy. It means recognizing that your time, your thoughts, your peace are sacred. Not everyone deserves access to your inner world. And once you embrace that truth, you stop trying to fit in, because you realize you were never meant to. It's the same logic behind pruning a tree. You cut back what's unnecessary so the roots can grow deeper. Less noise, more clarity, fewer distractions, more focus. And ironically, by stepping back from the world, you begin to see it more clearly. You understand the price of isolation and still choose to pay it. Because in the end, this isn't about being above others. It's about being aligned with yourself. And once you master that kind of inner independence, well, your entire life starts to change. So now I ask you, when was the last time you chose silence over noise and felt peace instead of fear? How many of your social interactions actually nourish your soul, and how many drain it? If Schopenhauer was right, maybe your craving for solitude isn't something to fix, but something to follow. Maybe it's not loneliness, maybe it's a sign that your mind is evolving. What would happen if you stopped apologizing for needing space? What would change if you protected your inner world the same way you protect your phone's password? This isn't about rejecting the world, it's about learning to engage with it on your terms. That's what strategic distancing really is. Freedom disguised as solitude. If this hit home for you, tell me in the comments. How do you deal with the pressure to be social in a shallow world? And if you're hungry for more conversations like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning.